Really is a pleasure to be with you today. My name is Jonathan Keller, and I am the CEO of California Family Council. It's great to be back in Rockland. I actually live in Fresno, but lived in Citrus Heights for about 8 years and went to Sierra College. Sorry, Dr. Jackson, but I love William Jessup, and I love the community of believers that support this university and the amazing kingdom work that they are doing. I wanted to give you briefly just kind of an overview of how we got here and what is at stake. I have lived in California since 1985. I was actually born in Wichita, Kansas. But over the last 35 years in this state, I've got to see God do some really great things, but I've also seen, sadly, what has happened, like Scott mentioned and like we heard in the video, what has happened when we as the church have frankly abdicated our responsibility. We have abdicated our abilities and our duties to be salt and light in the culture. It wasn't that long ago, in the 1980s, 1980, 1984, 1988, there were 3 presidential elections that decade. Today, we think of California as this bastion of liberal progressivism. But in the 1980s, all 3 of those elections, the presidential winner of the state of California was the conservative, pro-life Republican. Now, if you're a young person, you might find that hard to believe, but that actually happened only less than 40 years ago. Now, we've seen some very interesting things happen here in our state even since then. Going back to the year 2000, some of you may have heard of an initiative at the time that was called Proposition 22. Prop 22 was an initiative that dealt with marriage. It was before Proposition 8, 8 years before Prop 8. It dealt with the idea of marriage being defined as between one man and one woman. The remarkable thing about that, only 20 years ago, 61% of the voters of this state, 4.6 million people, voted affirmatively that they believed in the biblical definition of marriage. 61%. Now, unsurprisingly, some of our elected officials did not like that, and they chose to begin ignoring the will of the people. They began to push and try to thwart the Democratic votes that had happened. So in 2008, we took another vote. Now, that vote was much closer. It was 52% to 48%, but it resulted in a constitutional amendment. And in Proposition 8's case, it became the law of the land, the Constitution of the state of California, that marriage was between one man and one woman. Now, I want to point out for you, there were 7 million votes cast in that case. That's 2 million more votes than the Republican presidential candidate, John McCain, received that year. That means you had millions of California individuals who voted for President Barack Obama, but at the same time, even though they agreed with him on some policy issues, even then they knew that marriage had to be defined as God created in the book of Genesis. That was 12 short years ago, ladies and gentlemen. How far we have fallen in that short period of time. Now, just in the last 6 years that I have been with California Family Council, after the 2013 decision that overturned Prop 8 and mandated gay marriage throughout the state of California, and the 2015 decision that mandated it nationwide, California has essentially opened the floodgates on essentially spitting in the face of God on a whole host of different issues. Later today, you're going to hear from my friend Wynette Sills. She's going to talk about the sanctity of human life and how that is being challenged by legislation in Sacramento, including a bill that was just passed last year. You're going to hear from my colleague, Greg Burt, talking about some of the dangerous legislation, not only school curriculum, but relating to transgender treatments for minors. It was just signed by Governor Newsom a few weeks ago. But I wanted to give you one positive, upbeat note of what happens when the church is the church. Even though our numbers are very outnumbered in the state capitol, there have been these glimmering moments where Greg and I and our work at California Family Council have seen what happens when followers of Jesus stand up, they speak out, and they engage our culture. One of those happened in 2015. This was a bill that dealt with pregnancy care centers. How many of you in the room, you can raise your hands at home if you're at home, how many of you here in the room have any familiarity with pregnancy care centers? Awesome. If you're not familiar, there are these incredible pro-life institutions that do outreach to women in unplanned pregnancies. The state of California did not like the fact that these were taking business away from abortion clinics. So they mandated that every one of those clinics had to post notices in their lobbies, on their websites, in their printed materials that said, you may be entitled to a free or low-cost abortion from the state of California. Here is where you can go and get it. Obviously, that goes directly in contradiction to the very mission of most of these centers, many of which were actually faith-based, many of which were run in conjunction with churches. And yet, despite hundreds of women and mothers with their children coming to the Capitol and speaking out in opposition to that bill, the state legislature passed the bill. They steamrolled them, and Governor Brown signed it into law. Now, you might be saying, well, I thought you were going to give us some encouragement. How is this a good news story? Well, here's why. Because those of us who were in the room when that bill was introduced, we were discouraged. I'll be honest, we were a little defeated and depressed the day that it was passed, the day that it was signed. But God had a bigger plan in mind. I was so privileged in 2018 to be able to be standing on the steps of the United States Supreme Court when the case of NIFLA v. Becerra, the National Institute of Family Life Advocates, versus Becerra, our Attorney General for California, that case was argued in front of the United States Supreme Court. And as I spoke to the crowds of people there on the steps of the court, I told them that it was a long 3-year journey to get from inside the California Capitol to there on the steps of the Supreme Court, but we were confident God was going to do something special. Because the church, because people of faith did not give up and back down just because they suffered an initial defeat, that bill was ruled unconstitutional at the United States Supreme Court by a vote of 5-4. Yeah, you can clap for that. I saw a couple people starting to do that. That's okay. That bill not only had an impact in the state of California, but because of how broad the reach was, it actually slammed the door on similar laws that were beginning to be introduced in Hawaii, in Washington State, and New Jersey. That victory in California, the fact that California Christians did not give up, didn't just have an effect here, it rippled across the entire country. 2 other quick examples, and then I'm going to move on and tell you a little bit more about how you can be involved. In 2016, we had a bill that would have deeply affected William Jessup University. It was called SB 1146. We had a state legislator who believed that it was unfair that Christian colleges were able to set their own admissions policies, that they had to allow you to sign a statement of faith for you to be a student here. So this member of the legislature said, we are going to punish every Christian college, William Jessup University, Azusa Pacific, Point Loma, Biola, sorry for the competition, Dr. Jackson, but all of these great Christian universities across the state, they would no longer be allowed to admit students who were on state financial aid. And in talking to many of them across the state, in some cases that represents 5 to 10%. In some cases, it's 25 to 50% of the students are on some form of state financial aid. It would have devastated many of our Christian colleges in the state of California. And yet, the church during that time stood up. They spoke out, not in anger, but in love and in resolute conviction. And that bill was amended. There were 5 sections of it. The 4 worst sections of it were amended. And essentially, even though it technically passed, it was completely gutted from its original form. A massive victory. The final one I will tell you is, I think, maybe my favorite because it was the most immediate. In 2018, a young state assembly member named Evan Lowe introduced a bill called AB 2943. This would have banned so-called conversion therapy. But the way that was defined in the bill, any conversation between a pastor, between a counselor, between even a teacher and a student, a client, a counselor and a counselee, if that conversation related to unwanted same-sex attractions, that was going to be illegal. This potentially meant that accountability groups, Bible studies, Christian retreats, any of these could be targeted by the government and declared illegal. But again, in 2018, the people of God stood up respectfully, lovingly, but firmly, and they spoke out. We met with people across the state of California. We had huge groups of people, including a rally, almost 500 people that came to the Capitol in downtown Sacramento, including dozens of men and women who God had delivered from transgenderism, from same-sex attraction, and they all told their personal stories about how it was not about conversion therapy, it was about conversion. And that was what the church stood behind, lovingly and respectfully. As a result of that, and I'll close with this, Evan Lowe had passed this bill out of the Assembly. He had passed it out of the Senate. There was one minor amendment in the Senate, so it had to come back to the Assembly for a concurrence vote. And he kept pushing it back and pushing it back and pushing it back. And on the final day of the legislative session, he sent out a press release, and he said, after consultation with the faith community in the state, I have decided that I want to continue our dialogue, and I believe this legislation is not warranted at this time, so I'm pulling the bill. That's what happens, ladies and gentlemen, when we, the church, act as the church. That is what is at stake, not just on November 3rd, but on December 3rd, on January 3rd, on February 3rd, and for the next amount of time that God gives our country and our state.